The deafening crack of a single gunshot echoed through the valley as Adelaide Parker's world shattered into pieces. Her father's Winchester rifle still smoking, the message was clear: no one would leave Cottonwood Ranch against Horace Parker's wishes, especially not his only daughter. "You'll marry Judge Harmon by week's end, or so help me God. I'll see you locked in that cellar until you come to your senses," Horace Parker declared, his weathered face contorted with rage beneath his silver-streaked beard. 18 years I've fed you, clothed you, and this is how you repay my kindness." Adelaide stood her ground, her blue calico dress whipping around her ankles in the Nebraska wind. At 22, she'd waited patiently for her chance at happiness, but not like this, not sold off to settle her father's gambling debts to a man thrice her age. "I would rather die than marry that man," Adelaide said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. Mother would never have allowed this. The mention of his late wife only fueled Horace's anger. His calloused hand struck Adelaide across the face with such force that she stumbled backward, tasting blood where her lip had split against her teeth. "Your mother isn't here," he snarled, grabbing Adelaide's arm. "And Judge Harmon's money will save this ranch. You'll do as you're told." That night, as promised, Adelaide found herself imprisoned in the root cellar beneath the main house, a space no bigger than a horse stall with earthen walls that smelled of damp soil and rotting vegetables. Her father had thrown in a thin blanket and a lantern before bolting the door from the outside. 3 days to reconsider, he'd said through the wooden slats. "The judge will be here on Friday." It was Tuesday, May 17, 1873. Adelaide shivered in the cool underground air, tears finally flowing freely down her face. Her father had changed since her mother's death 2 winters ago, gambling away their savings and drowning his sorrows in whiskey. But she never thought he'd resort to this, trading his own daughter to a man known for burying 3 wives already. As the night wore on, Adelaide huddled in the corner, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into darkness. The cellar was securely built. Her grandfather had constructed it to withstand tornadoes and store provisions through harsh winters. No one would hear her cries for help. Miles away in Nebraska City, Quentin Drake adjusted his hat against the setting sun as he guided his dun gelding down the main street. At 26, he'd earned his reputation as one of the finest horse trainers in the territory, breaking and gentling wild mustangs that others claimed were untamable. His latest delivery, a pair of matched chestnuts for the railroad superintendent, had earned him a handsome payment, and he intended to enjoy a proper meal before heading back to his modest homestead east of town. The Lazy River Saloon buzzed with its usual evening crowd card players, cattle hands fresh off the trail, and a handful of girls working the floor with practiced smiles. Quentin found a corner table, nodding to familiar faces as he settled in. "Drake." "Thought you were still out chasing wild horses," called Samuel Wilson, the town's blacksmith. The burly man pulled up a chair, signaling for another round of drinks. "Just delivered those chestnuts to Superintendent Davis," Quentin replied, accepting the glass of whiskey with a grateful nod. "Heading back out tomorrow for a new commission." Samuel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You heard about Horace Parker? Word is he's marrying off his daughter to Judge Harmon on account of some debts." Quentin's hand tightened around his glass. "Adelaide Parker, the one with the amber eyes." "That's the one. Pretty little thing." Samuel shook his head. "Judge is old enough to be her grandfather, not to mention mean as a rattlesnake, but Parker's desperate, been losing at cards for months. Rumor has it the girl's refusing and he's keeping her locked up till she agrees." Quentin remembered Adelaide from town gatherings, intelligent, spirited, with a gentle way about her that reminded him of his late sister. They'd spoken briefly at last year's harvest dance, and he'd been struck by her knowledge of horses and quiet determination. "That's not right," Quentin said, his jaw tightening. "A woman's not cattle to be traded." "Since when has right mattered to men like Parker or the judge?" Samuel replied with a shrug. Not our business anyway. But as Quentin left the saloon that night, the story festered in his mind. He'd seen firsthand what happened to women forced into loveless marriages. His own mother had withered away under his father's cruel hand, and his sister had fled into an equally disastrous union to escape their home, only to die in childbirth a year later. By dawn, he'd made up his mind. The Cottonwood Ranch lay a day's ride southwest of town. He could be there by nightfall if he pushed his horse. Adelaide woke to the sound of the cellar door being unlatched. Daylight streamed in, momentarily blinding her after the darkness. Her younger brother Timothy's face appeared in the opening, his expression taut with worry. "I brought you some food," he whispered, climbing down the wooden steps and setting a cloth-wrapped bundle beside her. At 16, Timothy still obeyed their father out of fear, but his conscience was clearly troubling him. "Father's gone to town to finalize arrangements with the judge. He'll be back by sundown." Adelaide unwrapped the bundle, finding bread, cheese, and an apple. Her stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. "Thank you," she said, squeezing her brother's hand. "Tim, you have to help me leave. I can't marry the judge. You know what they say about his other wives." Timothy's gaze dropped to the dirt floor. "I don't know how." "Father would kill me, and where would you go? We've got no other family." "Anywhere would be better than here," Adelaide insisted. "Please, Tim, I'll find work in another town. I can sew, cook, teach children. Just help me get away before it's too late." Her brother's silence told her everything she needed to know. He was too frightened to defy their father, and she couldn't blame him. Horace Parker's temper had grown increasingly violent over the past year. "I'm sorry, Addie," Timothy said, rising to his feet. "I'll try to bring you more food tonight." After he left, bolting the door behind him, Adelaide curled up against the wall, despair washing over her. 2 more days until Friday. 2 days until Judge Harmon arrived to claim his bride. Night had fallen by the time Quentin approached Cottonwood Ranch. He'd left his gelding tethered in a stand of cottonwoods a quarter-mile back, not wanting to announce his arrival with hoofbeats. The main house stood dark except for a single lantern burning in what appeared to be the kitchen. Moving silently across the yard, Quentin assessed his surroundings. The barn stood open, housing several horses that nickered softly as he passed. A smaller building nearby appeared to be the bunkhouse, where likely a ranch hand or two slept. He was considering his next move when he spotted a young man emerging from the main house, carrying what looked like a covered plate. Quentin melted into the shadows, watching as the boy, who must be Adelaide's brother, crossed to a small structure partially built into the hillside behind the house. "A root cellar," Timothy's voice drifted through the night air. "Addie, I've brought you supper. Father's still in town, but he sent word he'll return before dawn." Quentin waited until the boy disappeared back into the house before approaching the cellar. The wooden door was secured with a heavy iron bolt, but no lock. "Adelaide," he called softly, crouching by the door, a moment of silence then. "Who's there?" "My name is Quentin Drake. We met at last year's harvest dance." He slid the bolt back carefully. "I've come to help you." When he pulled the door open, Adelaide stood at the bottom of the steps, clutching her shawl around her shoulders, her eyes wide with disbelief and hope. "Mr. Drake, how did you know?" "No time for explanations now," Quentin interrupted, offering his hand. "Your father will be back by morning." "We need to be far away by then." Adelaide hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. "Why would you risk this for me?" Quentin helped her up the steps, his expression solemn in the moonlight. "Because no one helped my sister when she needed it. Can you ride?" "Since I was 5, Adelaide replied, straightening her spine despite her exhaustion. "Good. We'll need to take your horse. Mine's too tired for 2 riders." Quentin guided her toward the barn, keeping to the shadows. "Is there anything you need from the house?" Adelaide shook her head, then paused. "My mother's locket. It's hidden beneath my mattress." "Too dangerous," Quentin said. "We can't risk waking anyone." Her face fell, but she nodded in understanding. Inside the barn, she pointed out her mare, a sleek bay named Penny, and quickly helped saddle her while Quentin kept watch. Timothy's voice suddenly cut through the darkness. "Addie, what are you doing?" They turned to find her brother standing in the barn doorway, a lantern held high, illuminating their guilty faces. "Tim, please," Adelaide whispered, moving toward him. "I can't stay. You know what will happen if I do." The boy's eyes shifted to Quentin, narrowing with suspicion. "Who is he?" "A friend," she assured him. "Someone trying to help." Timothy's hand trembled, the lantern casting wild shadows across the barn walls. "Father will blame me when he finds you gone." "Tell him you never saw us," Quentin suggested. "That the cellar was empty when you brought food." "He'll assume she escaped alone." The boy's internal struggle played across his young face. Finally, he lowered the lantern and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small silver locket. "I thought you might try to leave," he said, pressing it into Adelaide's palm. "Take this at least." Tears sprang to her eyes as she recognized their mother's locket. "Thank you, Tim. There's a pouch of coins in there too," Timothy added. "Not much, but enough to get you started somewhere new." Adelaide embraced her brother fiercely. "I'll write when I can, when I'm settled somewhere safe." "You need to go now," Timothy urged, pulling away. "I'll say I discovered you missing at breakfast. That gives you hours of head start." Minutes later, they were riding away from Cottonwood Ranch, Adelaide seated behind Quentin on her mare, her arms wrapped around his waist for stability. The night air felt like freedom against her face, though fear still clutched at her heart. "Where are we going?" she asked as they put distance between themselves and the ranch. "East," Quentin replied. "I have a homestead about 30 miles outside Nebraska City. We can rest there before deciding our next move." "You hardly know me," Adelaide said, confusion evident in her voice. "Why would you risk so much?" Quentin was silent for a long moment. "My sister was forced to marry a man like your Judge Harmon. She died a year later, broken in spirit long before her body gave out." He glanced back at her. "Some things aren't right to ignore, Miss Parker." They rode through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horse and drink from a stream. By dawn, they had covered considerable ground, but Quentin insisted they continue. Horace Parker wouldn't take his daughter's escape lightly, and they needed as much distance as possible before he discovered her missing. It was mid-afternoon when they reached Quentin's homestead, a modest cabin with a small barn and corral nestled against a stand of trees. A creek bubbled nearby, and a vegetable garden stretched along the southern edge of the clearing. "It's not much," Quentin said as he helped Adelaide dismount, her legs stiff from hours of riding. "But it's quiet and few people know its location." Adelaide surveyed the peaceful setting, relief washing over her exhausted body. "It's perfect." Inside, the cabin was simple but well kept, with a stone fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, and a curtained-off sleeping area. Quentin busied himself lighting a fire while Adelaide sank gratefully into a chair. "You can take the bed," he said, nodding toward the curtain. "I'll sleep out here." "I've imposed enough already," Adelaide protested. "I can't take your bed." "You're not imposing if you were invited," Quentin replied with a gentle smile. "Rest. You're safe here for now." Too tired to argue further, Adelaide retreated behind the curtain and fell onto the bed, sleep claiming her almost instantly, despite the unfamiliar surroundings. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, sunlight streaming through a small window indicating it was well into the next day. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was, panic seizing her until the events of the previous night came rushing back, pulling her wrinkled dress straight and attempting to smooth her tangled hair. Adelaide emerged from behind the curtain to find Quentin setting 2 plates on the table. "Good morning," he said. "Thought you might be hungry." "What time is it?" she asked, embarrassed to have slept so long. "Nearly noon," Quentin replied, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. "You needed the rest." As they ate, Quentin explained that his nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and he typically only went to town for supplies once a month. His livelihood came from capturing and training wild horses, which he sold to ranchers, the railroad, and occasionally the army. "We should be safe here for a while," he said. But eventually, your father will expand his search. Nebraska City isn't that far. Adelaide set down her fork, reality settling over her like a heavy blanket. I have nowhere else to go. No family, no friends who would risk harboring me against my father's wishes. What skills do you have? Quentin asked. If you wanted to start fresh somewhere else. I can so quite well, Adelaide replied after a moment's thought, and I've kept the ranch's accounts since my mother died. I'm good with numbers. Quentin nodded thoughtfully. Denver is growing fast. A woman with sewing and accounting skills could find work there, or San Francisco, though that's a much longer journey. I've never been further than Nebraska City, Adelaide admitted, a mixture of fear and excitement fluttering in her chest at the thought of such distant places. We have time to decide, Quentin assured her. For now, you're welcome to stay here while we figure things out. The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Adelaide insisted on earning her keep, taking over cooking and mending Quentin's clothes, which showed signs of bachelor neglect. He taught her about the wild horses he gentled, showing her how patience and understanding accomplished more than force or fear. A week passed, then two, with no sign of pursuit. They ventured into Nebraska City only once, carefully, with Adelaide disguised in men's clothing and her hair tucked under a hat. They purchased supplies and gathered news Judge Harmon was indeed furious, having posted a substantial reward for information on Adelaide's whereabouts. Horace Parker had reportedly torn apart the countryside looking for his daughter, even accusing Timothy of helping her escape. They'll eventually give up, Quentin said as they rode back to the homestead. Men like them have short attention spans when their pride is wounded. Adelaide wasn't convinced but chose not to argue. Each day away from her father and the judge felt like a gift, and she found herself growing increasingly comfortable in Quentin's company. He was unlike any man she'd known, quiet but not distant, strong but never imposing. He listened when she spoke, valued her opinions, and never made her feel like a burden despite the risk she'd brought to his doorstep. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie gold, Adelaide finally asked the question that had been lingering in her mind. "Why have you never married, Mr. Drake?" Quentin smiled at her continued formality, though they'd been living under the same roof for nearly 3 weeks. "Quentin, please. And to answer your question, I suppose I've been too busy building this place, training horses. Never met anyone who made me want to settle down properly." "No sweetheart in town," Adelaide pressed, surprising herself with her boldness. "No," he replied simply. "What about you? Was there someone before your father arranged the match with the judge?" Adelaide shook her head, her fingers absently tracing the pattern of her mother's locket around her neck. "Father wouldn't allow it, said I was too valuable to waste on some poor farmer's son." She laughed without humor. Ironic, considering he was willing to sell me to settle gambling debts. "You're not property to be sold," Quentin said, his voice suddenly fierce. "You never were." Something in his tone made Adelaide look up, finding his eyes on her with an intensity that sent warmth spreading through her chest. For a moment neither spoke, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. The moment broke when a distant horse's whinny caught Quentin's attention. He stood abruptly, scanning the horizon with narrowed eyes. "Get inside," he said quietly. "Someone's coming." Heart racing, Adelaide hurried into the cabin while Quentin moved toward the barn, emerging moments later with a rifle. She watched through the window as 2 riders approached, not her father, but men she recognized as ranch hands from neighboring properties. Relief washed over her when she heard snippets of their conversation. They'd come to ask about buying one of Quentin's trained horses, nothing more. But the interruption had served as a stark reminder. She couldn't stay hidden forever. That night, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Adelaide made her decision. "I need to go further west," she said. "Denver, perhaps, like you suggested. I can't keep hiding here, putting you at risk." Quentin set down his coffee cup, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Is that what you want?" "What I want doesn't matter," Adelaide replied. "It's what makes sense." "It matters to me," Quentin said softly. "What you want matters very much to me, Adelaide." The way he said her name like it was something precious made her breath catch. "I don't want to leave," she admitted finally, "but I don't see another choice." Quentin was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured as if he'd been carefully considering his words. "There is another option," he said. "You could stay. Not as a fugitive or a guest, but as more." Adelaide's heart thundered in her chest. "More? I never expected to find someone who fits so perfectly into my life," Quentin continued, meeting her gaze. "These weeks with you have been the happiest I can remember. I know it's too soon, and perhaps I'm no better than your father, offering marriage as a solution to your problems, but it's nothing like my father," Adelaide interrupted, reaching for his hand. "He wanted to trade me. You're offering me a choice." "A choice to stay," Quentin said, his fingers intertwining with hers. "To build something together. Not out of necessity, but because I've grown to care for you deeply, Adelaide, more than I thought possible in such a short time." Adelaide felt tears welling in her eyes, but for once they weren't born of fear or sadness. "I've grown to care for you too, but what about my father, the judge?" "Nebraska's a big territory," Quentin said. "And I've been thinking of expanding anyway. We could build somewhere new further west. Start fresh where no one knows your name." Hope, fragile but persistent, blossomed in Adelaide's chest. "You would leave your home. For me, this is just a place," Quentin replied, gesturing around them. "Home is something else entirely. I'm beginning to think it might be wherever you are." 2 months later, a wagon loaded with all their possessions creaked westward across the Nebraska plains. They'd been married by a traveling preacher in a small ceremony with only Quentin's closest friend as witness. Adelaide now wore a simple gold band alongside her mother's locket, symbols of her past and future bound together. They'd sold Quentin's homestead and purchased land near a growing settlement in western Nebraska, far enough from her father's reach to begin anew. Word had reached them that Judge Harmon had found another bride, a 17-year-old daughter of a desperate farmer, and Adelaide prayed silently for the girl's well-being. Timothy had managed to send a letter, smuggled through a sympathetic ranch hand, assuring Adelaide he was well, and their father, though still bitter about her escape, had eventually ceased his search efforts, too proud to admit his daughter had outsmarted him. "Any regrets?" Quentin asked as they made camp one evening, the sunset painting the endless prairie in shades of amber and gold. Adelaide looked up from the fire she was building, taking in the sight of her husband tending the horses, the man who had risked everything to give her a choice, who had shown her that love wasn't about possession but partnership. "Not a single one," she replied truthfully. "Though I do wonder what might have happened if you hadn't heard about my situation that night." Quentin moved to sit beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I like to think our paths would have crossed eventually. Some things are just meant to be." Adelaide leaned into his embrace, savoring the security and warmth she found there. "For someone who trains wild horses, Mr. Drake, you're surprisingly romantic." "Only with you, Mrs. Drake," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Only with you." 5 years later, the small cabin Quentin had built had expanded into a proper ranch house. Their horse breeding operation had flourished, with Quentin's trained stock sought after throughout the territory. Adelaide had established a small but successful dressmaking business, catering to the growing number of settlers' wives eager for a touch of fashion on the frontier. Their greatest joy, however, was their family 3-year-old Samuel, named for the blacksmith friend who had unwittingly set their story in motion by telling Quentin about Adelaide's plight, and 1-year-old Margaret, named for Adelaide's mother. On the 5th anniversary of the night Quentin had freed her from the cellar, Adelaide stood on their porch, watching her husband teaching little Samuel to brush a gentle mare while baby Margaret slept in her cradle nearby. A letter had arrived that morning from Timothy, now 21 and running Cottonwood Ranch since their father's death the previous winter. He wrote that the judge had finally met his match in his fourth wife, who had apparently poisoned his whiskey after enduring 2 years of cruelty. No one mourned the judge's passing, and the young widow had mysteriously disappeared with a substantial portion of his fortune. Adelaide smiled at the poetic justice in the news, but felt no desire to return to her childhood home, even with her father gone. Timothy was welcome to visit, but Nebraska City and all its painful memories belonged firmly in her past. "What are you thinking about?" Quentin asked, coming up behind her and sliding his arms around her waist. Adelaide leaned back against his chest, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. "How sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead us to the best ones. If my father hadn't locked me in that cellar, I might never have found you. And I might have spent my life training horses, never knowing what I was missing," Quentin replied, his voice warm against her ear. "Though I like to think I would have found the courage to court you properly eventually." Adelaide turned in his arms, rising on tiptoes to kiss him softly. "Thank you for being brave enough to break me out that night. Thank you for being brave enough to come with me," he countered. "Not many women would have trusted a stranger with such a risk." "You weren't a stranger," Adelaide said, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Somehow, I think I knew even then that you were my future." As the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing their land in the golden light of another ending day, Adelaide Parker Drake said a silent prayer of gratitude for locked cellar doors and courageous cowboys, who believed that love, not ownership, was what truly mattered in this wild, expansive country they called home.